The silence inside Wagon 7 was not the soothing quiet of a sleeping house, but the dense, heavy vacuum left by a screaming crowd that had abruptly vanished 30 years prior. It pressed down on Silas, a physical weight that settled on his shoulders and tightened the muscles around his chest, until breathing felt like a deliberate, painful effort. He was 11 years old, perhaps closer to 12, though the exact measure of time had grown hazy, meaningless, since the last time a genuine adult had looked at him with care, rather than with impatience or thinly veiled disgust. Wagon 7 had once belonged to the principal clown of the Starlight Spectacular. Its interior was a mausoleum of mildewed glamour. The air itself was thick, saturated with the faint, lingering scent of ancient greasepaint and sweat, a sickly sweet chemical perfume overlaid by the sharper, earthy tang of decay. Silas sat curled on a narrow cot in the darkest corner. The cot's mattress was lumpy, its ticking split in 3 places, spilling resilient grey tufts of horsehair and cotton batting. He pulled the thin, rough woolen blanket, salvaged from the dumpster behind the laundry tent, higher toward his chin. The cold of late autumn was a cruel, insistent visitor, penetrating the single brittle pane of the wagon's window and sinking into the wooden floorboards, which groaned beneath even the slightest shift in weight. His stomach, a hollow drum in his torso, emitted a low, continuous rumble that, in the oppressive silence, sounded deafening to his own ears. Hunger was no longer a sharp pang, but a dull, pervasive ache, a constant reminder of his vulnerability and solitude. He had eaten the last of his stolen biscuit 2 hours ago, rationing the small, dry crumbs to prolong the illusion of sustenance. Now, there was only the dry, metallic taste of fear and want on his tongue. The sole light source entered through a high, narrow ventilation slat near the ceiling, cutting a sharp, dusty beam across the clutter of the wagon. In that weak light, Silas could see the details of his confinement. Ropes coiled and petrified with age, stacks of gaudy, faded silk costumes smelling faintly of naphthalene, and everywhere a blanket of fine, orange-red sawdust that seemed to grow perpetually from the floorboards. His focus narrowed to a specific object half hidden beneath a dusty pile of discarded nose wigs, a box. It had been there since he first claimed this refuge, a sturdy, rectangular shadow that he had mentally catalogued as useless container and dismissed. Today, however, driven by the desperation born of cold and hunger, the box pulled at his attention. Everything else in the wagon had been thoroughly investigated, poked, and dismissed as junk. This box, resting innocently near the wall, represented the final, minute possibility of comfort. He slowly uncurled, his joints protesting with stiff, almost painful clicks. The movement was slow, deliberate, minimizing the chance of startling the various rats and mice that shared his sanctuary. His movements were always economical, born of the necessity of conserving every calorie. He reached the area where the box lay. It was wedged tightly against the interior wall paneling, slightly tilted. He knelt, his knees protesting sharply against the cold wood floor, and used the tips of his numb fingers to gently sweep away the top layer of sawdust and dust bunnies, which scattered like tiny, greyish ghosts. The box was about the size of a shoebox, but flatter and wider. It was constructed of dark, heavy wood, perhaps mahogany or a similarly dense hardwood, now deeply scratched and marred. Its surface was no longer smooth. Time, dampness, and neglect had given it a texture like dried orange peel. Silas brushed a final layer of grit from the lid. A small brass latch, tarnished to an ugly green-black patina, held the lid firmly shut. He ran his thumb over the brass. It was freezing, absorbing the faint heat from his skin immediately. He hesitated. This pause was not just about mechanical caution. It was an emotional safeguard. Hope, even the smallest shard of it, was dangerous. It required energy, and if shattered, the resulting despair was paralyzing. He had learned to anticipate and deflect hope like a painful blow. "It will be empty," he told himself sternly, watching the slight tremor in his own hand. "It will contain nothing but rotten fabric or old glue. It is useless." But the very act of dismissing it fueled a counter-argument. If it was useless, why had the clown taken the time to secure the latch? Why hadn't it been left open, spilling its contents? With a sudden resolve, fueled by the sheer urgency of his physical discomfort and the need for mental distraction, he slid the latch back. It made a dry, soft click, a sound disproportionately loud in the heavy silence of the wagon. He grasped the front edge of the lid with both hands, his palms sweating faintly despite the cold, and applied a gentle, steady, upward pressure. The hinges, surprisingly, did not shriek. They opened with a quiet, grinding shhh, muffled by the decades of accumulated dust, acting as a dry lubricant. Silas peered inside. The shaft of light, now diffused by the opening lid, bathed the interior. He slumped forward slightly, his meager hope instantly deflated. His prediction had been correct, yet the confirmation was still a sharp, swift disappointment that tasted metallic, like blood on the back of his throat. The box was, fundamentally, empty. It was not stuffed with old silks or crumpled drawings. It held no forgotten pocket watch, no dried, hard piece of candy, no object of value or utility. The entire interior was lined with a deep, sumptuous emerald velvet, but the velvet was faded almost to a pale olive color in patches, and the texture was flattened and dull, not the plush nap it must once have possessed. Across this worn lining there were perhaps 3 or 4 tiny, insignificant artifacts. A single, dried, dark brown smudge, which he identified immediately as dried blood, stained the velvet near the back corner. A few crystalline remnants, like shards of frosted sugar, were scattered faintly near the front edge, smelling vaguely of wintergreen and alcohol, likely the residue of some kind of facial solvent or setting powder. And that was all. Silas felt the cold return, with renewed intensity, no longer just physical, but reaching into the core of his spirit. He carefully lowered the lid back down, ready to dismiss the box forever, and retreat back to his uncomfortable cot. But as he slid the box back toward the wall, the heavy wood caught on a loose floorboard. He nudged it harder, intending to shove it out of sight, and the slight force caused the box to shift unevenly. He heard a sound, not a rattle, not a click, but a deep, muted thump, as if something heavy but small had shifted position inside a hollow cavity. He froze. His heart, which had slowed to a dreary rhythmic pump, jerked back to an alert, rapid drum. He lifted the box again, slowly rotating it in his hands. It was definitely heavier toward the back edge, specifically the side that had just knocked against the floorboard. He turned it completely over, examining the bottom panel, but it was solid, scarred wood, exactly like the sides. He held it up to the sliver of light, angling it this way and that. The construction seemed seamless. There were no obvious joints or hinges on the exterior, apart from the lid. Silas set the box down with painstaking gentleness, feeling a peculiar mixture of rising curiosity and dread. He was now operating on pure instinct, the primal need to understand his environment. He reopened the lid, revealing the disappointing velvet. He ran his fingers along the interior lining, pressing firmly against the wooden frame underneath. The sides were solid. The front was solid. The lid was rigid. But when his fingers reached the back interior panel, the part directly over where the thump had originated, there was a minute, almost imperceptible give. He pressed again, harder this time, along the top edge of the back panel, right where the velvet met the wooden frame. His fingers detected the subtlest seam, a break in the uniform texture of the wood beneath the cloth. It was a hidden compartment, the kind of secret meant to hold something deeply private, something that the owner desperately wished to conceal, even from accidental observation. driven now by a powerful surge of adrenaline, not from external threat, but from the internal excitement of potential discovery. Silas worked meticulously. He scraped at the edge of the velvet with the very tip of his thumbnail, careful not to tear the fragile fabric. The velvet peeled back easily, revealing not a seam, but a perfectly engineered tongue-and-groove joint, held fast by a tiny rusted metal lever. The lever was perhaps 3 millimeters long, almost invisible, nestled right into the corner. He tried to pry it with his nail, but it was set too firmly. He needed a tool, something fine and strong. He looked around the immediate vicinity of the cot, his gaze sweeping over the dust-coated items. His eyes landed on a small rusted safety pin, snagged on the remnants of a faded red sash that lay near his blanket. It was bent, but its point was still relatively sharp. He retrieved the pin, maneuvering it carefully back to the box. His hands were shaking slightly again, but this time not from cold or fear, but from the intensity of his concentration. He inserted the point of the pin into the minute gap next to the lever, pushing slowly, steadily. There was the scrape of metal on metal, a sound that felt enormous and risky in the silence. He pushed the pin further, using it to apply leverage to the small metal nub. The rust fought him, resisting the movement. He strained, holding his breath, his face close to the box, smelling the ancient dry aroma of wood and old oils. Screeching. The lever snapped backward. The back interior panel, which had seemed so solid, did not fall away. Instead it retracted, sliding silently downwards perhaps half an inch, then folding inward like a miniature trapdoor, revealing a narrow, deep space beneath. Silas peered into the cavity. It was smaller than the main box, perhaps 5 inches long and only 1.5 inches deep, perfectly sized to hold a very specific inventory. The velvet lining here was pristine, protected from the air and dust. It was a rich, deep purple, almost the color of bruised plums. And this space was decidedly not empty. Silas reached in with careful fingers. The objects inside were cool to the touch, heavy with their own silent history. The first object he withdrew was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of parchment, tied not with twine, but with a thin strand of braided black human hair, glossy and smooth, even after decades. He laid this scroll carefully beside the box. The second object was heavier, a small dark stone, perfectly polished and ovular, fitting neatly into the curve of his palm. It was cool and utterly inert, unremarkable except for its strange weight and the sheer perfection of its shape. He turned it over, looking for writing, but it was just stone. The third object was the most intriguing. It was a shallow, circular tin box, no larger than the palm of his hand, made of highly detailed hammered copper. The lid was pressed on tightly, sealed against the elements. He spent several cautious minutes trying to pry the copper lid free, using the pin and his fingernails, fearing he might damage the delicate metalwork. Finally, with a sharp pop of released pressure, the lid came off. Inside was not face paint or dried powder or any conventional makeup supply. The tin was filled, not with a solid block, but with a stiff, creamy paste, the color of rich, dark earth. It looked like clay, but smelled faintly and sweetly of almonds and something metallic, like iron filings mixed with clove. Silas touched the paste gingerly with the tip of his index finger. It was cold and yielding, slightly oily. He rubbed the residue between his fingers. It stained his skin immediately, a deep, unsettling maroon, darkening rapidly to a theatrical, Venus black. It was pigment, a thick, concentrated, deeply dark makeup base. He realized what he was holding, the signature color of the original clown of the Starlight Spectacular, the color used to draw the heavy, stylized tears, the sharp, severe lines of profound, silent sorrow that had made the clown, known only as Le Regret, famous. The discovery was unsettling. This wasn't a box of frivolous glamour. It was a box of profound, concentrated emotion. Silas placed the tin carefully on the floor, allowing his mind to absorb the immediate implications. This box had belonged to a person who dealt in performance, yet who guarded their tools of trade with fierce secrecy. He turned his attention back to the small scroll, tied with the lock of hair. He unwrapped the hair, his fingers moving slowly, reverently. The hair felt soft, still possessed of an uncanny life. He unrolled the parchment. It was not a single sheet, but several thin layers glued seamlessly together, making it tough and brittle, resisting the tendency to curl. The parchment was filled with extraordinarily fine, spidery handwriting, done in a faded sepia ink. The script was formal, almost theatrical in its elegance, but the content, when he finally began to read it, was devastatingly intimate. Silas had learned to read in dusty library corners and from discarded textbooks, and though some of the ornate vocabulary was difficult, the meaning pierced straight through the formality. The text was a journal entry, dated precisely 44 years earlier. October 19th. The damp settles in the bones, a reminder of the inevitable rot that waits for the painted smile. They cheer the mask, never the man beneath. They demand the spectacle of invented grief, but flee from the authentic shadow. Silas's breath hitched. He sat back on his heels, the cold floor momentarily forgotten. This was not a business log or a practice schedule. This was a confession. He continued to read, tracing the fragile lines with his eyes, the words etching themselves into the landscape of his own solitary experience. I have perfected the line of the mouth turned down. It is not a trick of technique. It is a trick of transference. I summon the weight of the absences in my own life, the mother who never truly saw me, the father whose silence was a weapon, and I place that weight onto the character. The audience believes they are witnessing art. They are witnessing an evacuation. The word absence resonated in Silas's chest like a slow, deep bell. His own life was built on absences, the absence of a fixed home, the absence of warm meals, and the crushing, profound absence of anyone who claimed him. He lowered the parchment slightly, needing to breathe deeply to steady the sudden influx of emotion. He was reading the precise, raw documentation of another human being's crushing loneliness, hidden inside a box designed to hold superficiality. He returned to the text. It continued, focusing on the mechanics of emotional survival. The work is this, to make the unbearable beautiful. If I can take this raw, agonizing material, this grief that sits in the hollow of my chest like a cold, heavy stone, and project it outward until it is applauded, then perhaps, for 90 minutes, it ceases to be mine. It belongs to the theater. It belongs to the crowd. And I am left, briefly, hollowed out and temporarily safe. The passage was interrupted by a detailed, meticulous drawing, sketched in the same sepia ink. It was a face, severe and haunting, with impossibly high, arched brows. But the eyes were the focus. They were sketched with an almost unbearable realism, wide, shadowed, and conveying a look of utter, desolate comprehension. The description below the drawing was specific. The eyes must never lie. The audience demands truth, even if the surrounding framework is deceit. The eyes are the aperture of the soul. They require only a hint of the pigment, a thin line drawn with the brush found in the fourth compartment, the brush of the heart. Silas instinctively reached back into the hidden space. He had completely missed the final compartment. The drawer was segmented into 4 narrow slots. He had pulled the pigment tin from the third. He felt around the 4th segment, his fingers brushing against something delicate, cylindrical, and surprisingly cold. He withdrew the final object. It was a brush, yes, but unlike any he had seen. Its handle was thin, perhaps 6 inches long, made of polished, dark obsidian, cool and smooth. The bristles were extraordinarily fine, tapering to a needle-sharp point, tied tightly with silk thread. This was the brush of the heart, Holding the brush, the parchment, and the small tin of dense dark pigment, Silas felt an overwhelming sense of connection, a sudden, powerful intimacy with a ghost he had never known. The cold of the wagon faded slightly, replaced by the unexpected heat of this encounter. He flipped the parchment over. The remaining text was instructional, a methodology for survival disguised as a makeup tutorial. To survive the mask, you must first master the materials. The pigment of regret is not merely black, it is the consolidation of shadow. It must be applied only when the true feeling is present, never as a frivolous prop. If you find this, if the dust has not yet swallowed this small legacy, you are perhaps like me, alone, searching for a form that can hold the pain without breaking the vessel. Do not paint a happy face simply because the world demands it. Do not paint sorrow that you have not earned. Find the line that defines your present reality and trace it. It is not about concealment, it is about definition. When the solitude becomes too vast, when the silence is crushing the ability to breathe, take the stone. Silas looked down at the smooth, polished, dark oval stone he still held in his left hand. It has weight. It has reality. Hold it firmly. Feel its cold density. It is the counterweight to despair. It is the truth of the earth beneath the painted floorboards. It proves that something, somewhere, is solid, even when everything else is turning to dust. Silas tightened his grip on the stone. It felt cold, yes, but undeniably real. It wasn't soft like fabric or fragile like glass. It was immutable. A small, silent anchor in the swirling chaos of his life. The final line of the parchment was simple, stark, and utterly devastating in its candor. You are seen, not by them, but by this moment. Now, survive. Silas sat in silence for a long time, the scroll trembling slightly in his hands. Tears, sharp and sudden, welled in his eyes, not from sorrow, but from the shock of recognition. He had been seen across decades by a man whose life had mirrored his own crushing isolation. He was not just an unwanted child hidden in a decaying wagon. He was the inheritor of a philosophy of dignified survival. He slowly, meticulously rolled the parchment back up, securing it again with the lock of hair, handling it with the extreme care one reserves for priceless, fragile relics. He placed the scroll, the obsidian brush, the tin of pigment, and the smooth, heavy stone back into the deep, secret cavity of the box. He slid the mechanism shut, hearing the tiny, reassuring snick of the lever locking into place. The velvet surface was once again seamless, hiding the painful, beautiful truth within. He took a deep, shuddering breath of the stale, cold air. The hunger was still there, a low, demanding pressure, but it was overshadowed by an urgent, necessary emotional task. He needed to draw, not to distract himself, but to define himself as the clown had instructed. He looked around the wagon again, his eyes now scanning for implements. He needed paper and a surface to work on. He found no clean paper. Every scrap was too brittle, too damp, or too heavily stained with oil and mold. He spotted a stack of old show posters, rolled tightly in the corner, forgotten advertisements for the final disastrous season of the Starlight Spectacular. They were large, made of thick, high-quality, matte paper stock. The backs, though dusty, were blank. Silas crawled over and wrestled a single poster free. It was stiff, protesting against being unrolled. The front depicted the smiling, gaudy, full-color faces of acrobats and the enormous, toothy grin of the lion tamer. The back was a dull, textured white. He smoothed the paper onto the cot, making a flat, if slightly bumpy, surface. He reopened the secret compartment, retrieving only the obsidian brush and the tin of regret pigment. He hesitated over the stone, but chose not to take it yet. The stone was for moments of absolute despair. This was a moment of necessary creation. He needed water to thin the pigment, which was too thick and oily to flow easily. Water was scarce. His canteen was nearly empty, reserved only for necessary hydration. He looked towards the window, where the cold, wet air of the late afternoon had condensed against the glass pane. Tiny rivulets of pure, cold water were running down the inside surface, pooling faintly along the windowsill. Silas gently leaned over, holding the copper tin. He dipped the tip of the obsidian brush into the condensation pool, wetting the bristles. Then he carefully carried the moisture back to the tin, touching the wet brush to the surface of the dense, dark paste. The moment the water hit the pigment, the mixture softened, dissolving the thick, creamy base into a workable, inky black substance. He stirred the surface gently with the brush, mixing the pigment until it achieved the precise, velvety darkness he imagined. The resulting mixture smelled strongly of almonds, earth, and ancient sorrow. He paused, the brush poised over the white paper. His hand, usually clumsy and trembling from undernourishment, was steady. He was no longer just Silas, the orphan. He was Silas, the apprentice, preparing to execute a sacred private ritual. He looked at the paper, then closed his eyes. He didn't want to draw what he saw in the wagon. He wanted to draw the architecture of his own feeling, the topography of his isolation. He began, not with a sketch or a light guide, but with the full weight of the pigment. The first line was an arc, slow and deliberate, drawn just above the center of the page. It was the precise, heavy line of a brow, furrowed not in anger, but in the deep, constant labor of endurance. The ink flowed from the fine tip of the obsidian brush with flawless precision, a testament to the quality of both the tool and the pigment. The line was dark, definitive, and immediately conveyed an expression of silent, profound weariness. He continued, building the face feature by feature, but not a realistic face. It was stylized, exaggerated, following the haunting aesthetic of Le Regret. He focused on the eyes. He dipped the brush deeply into the black pigment, coating the fine bristles. He painted the shadows beneath the eyes first, heavy, sagging crescents that spoke of sleepless nights and perpetual alertness. Then came the eyes themselves. He rendered them large, asymmetrical, framed by the dark lines. He left the centers white, untouched by the pigment, stark and shocking against the black field. They were wide open, looking straight ahead, unblinking, devoid of hope or despair, only unwavering, exhausted presence. It was not a self-portrait. It was a depiction of his guardian spirit, the face of necessity. He worked in total silence, concentrating fiercely, allowing the cold and the hunger to recede, channeling every sensation into the tip of the brush. For the first time since he'd been left alone, Silas felt his entire being contained within a task, focused and utterly meaningful. He finished the face, sketching the severe line of the mouth, not fully downturned in abject grief, but held in a tense, level line, the expression of someone refusing to yield, even while bearing the entire weight of the world. He laid the brush down and leaned back, his own heart pounding heavily in his chest. The drawing stared back at him. It was devastatingly beautiful in its starkness. The sepia paper, the absolute black of the pigment, the wide, terrified eyes, it was the truth he carried, rendered external and immutable. He felt a profound shift. The pain had not vanished, but it had changed jurisdiction. It was no longer trapped inside him, corrosive and silent. It was now outside, defined, occupying the space on the poster board. He realized the immense power in the act of definition. To name the isolation, to draw the fear, was to establish a boundary between himself and the oppressive emotional environment. He felt the immediate, physical exhaustion that follows intense concentration, but also an unfamiliar lightness. He looked around the wagon. It was still cold, still dusty, still abandoned, but the silence no longer felt quite so threatening. He picked up the smooth, heavy stone from the hidden compartment, realizing he had opened the box again, purely out of instinct. He pressed the cold stone firmly against his cheek, then held it tightly in his closed fist. It has weight. It has reality. He knew with sudden clarity that he could not stay in the wagon forever. Survival demanded movement, demands sustenance, demands facing the world outside the rusted door. But he also knew he could not leave as Silas, the terrified, starving ghost. He needed the transformation described by Le Regret. He needed the definition. He needed to apply the pigment not to paper, but to himself, if only once, to solidify this new internal state. The idea was terrifying. Applying the makeup felt like a profound declaration, a crossing of a boundary into the dangerous performative world of the circus that had abandoned him. But the text hadn't instructed him to perform for others. It instructed him to define himself for himself. He looked around for a mirror. The wagon was too old, too poorly lit, too neglected to harbor a decent reflective surface. Then he remembered. Earlier in his residency, he had found a shattered, half-dollar-sized fragment of silvered glass tucked into a crack in the wall, perhaps a piece of a larger hand mirror. He had kept it out of mild superstition, seeing in its flawed surface only a fractured, terrifying image of his own gaunt face. He retrieved the shard. Its edge was dull, worn down by time, but the surface was still functional. He held the mirror in his left hand and the obsidian brush in his right. He dipped the brush into the black paste again, making sure the consistency was perfect. He focused on his reflection in the shard. The light was poor, illuminating only the structure of his cheekbones and the cavernous shadows beneath his eyes. He applied the brush tip to his face, just below the outer corner of his left eye. The coldness of the pigment struck his skin, a shocking temperature differential. It was sharp, oily, and immediately profoundly black. He drew a single, clean line. It was not a teardrop, but a precise, controlled line descending straight down the gaunt hollow of his cheek, stopping abruptly just above the jawline. It was a formal, stylized depiction of profound, concentrated grief, the line of Le Regret. He repeated the process on the right side. The silence returned, intensified, once the small, scratchy sound of the brush against his skin ceased. Silas lowered the mirror and the brush. He closed his eyes, inhaling slowly, counting the seconds. He opened them and looked at his reflection. The dark lines were stark, absolute. They didn't make him look happier or sadder. They made him look visible. They focused the truth of his experience onto his exterior. They turned his fear into form. He touched the line gently with the tip of his finger. The pigment was cold, smooth, and resistant. He picked up the small, heavy stone once more, pressing it into the center of his palm, feeling the solid, undeniable truth of its weight. The transformation was internal, but the mark was external. He was no longer just running from danger. He was carrying the dignified sorrow of the man who had preceded him, a silent witness to isolation. He placed the brush and the tin back into the hidden compartment, snapping the mechanism shut. He took the heavy stone and slipped it into the deep inner pocket of his coat, a pocket he had repaired specifically to keep his few, precious, necessary items safe. The cold pressed in again, but Silas's response was different. He stood up, slowly, deliberately. The weariness was still present, but now accompanied by an edge of fierce, defined resolve. He had survived the silence, and he had survived the revelation. He moved toward the wagon door, which was secured by a heavy, rusted iron bolt. He slid the bolt back, a groaning, echoing metallic sound, and pulled the heavy, splintered door open, allowing the cold, sharp air of the outside world to rush in. The sun was low, sinking toward the horizon, casting the entire abandoned circus lot in long, severe shadows. The air was colder outside, promising frost before morning. Silas stepped out onto the sawdust and dried earth, pulling his worn coat tight. He carried no food, no map, only the stone in his pocket and the sharp, indelible lines of black pigment defining his face. The world outside the wagon was vast and terrifying, but Silas was no longer merely a boy hiding from it. He was the keeper of a terrible, beautiful truth, defined and hardened by the legacy of Le Regret. The hunger in his stomach was still real, but it was now secondary to the immense, solid weight of the stone, the reminder that he, too, possessed substance. He began to walk, slowly, toward the edge of the sprawling, decaying grounds, his footsteps muffled by the old, red sawdust. He did not look back at Wagon 7. He was moving forward, carrying the defined, visible sorrow of his past, making himself solid enough to face the unknown requirements of the morning. His path was unclear, dangerous, and solitary, but for the first time, he walked with an internal gravity, anchored by the cold, dense stone and the truth painted on his face. He was seen, and by that sacred, lonely act of definition, he was prepared to survive.